is hosted by the Department of Politics and International Relations here at Westminster. This is our nice building. Actually, we've got more than one nice building. Anyway, as you saw from the foyer, this is quite a nice venue for a conference. And we're particularly happy to welcome you to this event because this has been organised by some of our postgraduate community. And we're very keen that the intellectual life of the department has a lot of input from our PhD students, because quite often we find that there's people that are doing some of the most interesting research and have a bit more time for reading and thinking about the world. And the project that they put together for today's conference, which I think Elisa will say a little bit more about in a few seconds, I think is a really exciting one. And I think, as you can see from the agenda, we've got a really good mix of experienced academics, younger academics, PhD students. And so hopefully we can really do some intellectual labouring, thinking about state building as a way in some of the shifts from a political, or what we might understand as a traditional political framework of looking at the world and thinking about intervention of states and how they work and how they relate to societies and maybe the global sphere, to what we might see as a more social or sociological understanding of the problems and how that shift, if there is a shift, might work and what are the underlying dynamics behind that. I'm sure that everyone will have quite different ways into looking at the issue. So hopefully we'll all get something out of it. So we'll to Louise.
Thank you, David, and thank you all for coming. Needless to say, we wouldn't be here if we didn't have an audience. So thank you all for coming. I think David put it as simply as we can, really, and I won't bore you with the details as to how we managed to get together and decide to host this. But what we try to do basically is have a look at the issue of state building, the discourse of state building, and look at how, as David said, this shift occurred from political framings of state building towards sociological framings of state building. And within this shift, we hoped to be able to get some submissions around central concepts to do with state building, like democracy promotion, civil society, nation building, gender politics, and the role possibly of the social and the political within the discourses of state building. What we hope to do today is discuss, walk us through this idea of the shift, walk us through what happened and why we stopped talking in terms of institutionalism, in terms of the political, and how it is that we started increasingly to consider things like democracy promotion, state building, to mean capacity building with increased intervention in civil society. So I'll leave it at that because I do actually want to give you space to talk. And hopefully the papers and the presenters will do the talking. We'll have some interesting discussion ahead of us. The title of the first panel is State Building in Society, Discursive Formations and Conceptual Approaches. We'll start with Marta Iniguez de Heredia. Is that good? Okay. With Authority B Transformation, accounting for contemporary state building through its absences.
Thank you. Well, thanks to the Westminster Department of Politics and International Relations, and of course to Elisa and Paul and Jessica for putting this together. This paper is based on my PhD research, which focuses on exploring the nature of resistance in the context of state building, and for that I take as a case study the Democratic Republic of Congo. But in order to explore the nature of resistance, obviously I need an account of what state building is, what is being resisted, and I take a sort of a kind of a sociological, historical sociological account in terms of looking at state-society relations. So this paper is actually part of that, kind of giving an account of what a state building is and how it is being deployed in a way. And in sort of theorizing what the nature of state building is, I take one particular feature of state building, that of political authority. And what I argue is that a state building is a claim to authority. How I define authority, I follow Shield Member to say that authority is sort of a practice, or it's a capacity to make wealth allocations and make it through practices of violence and dispossession, while making a claim to legitimacy, or even a sort of, this kind of thing of putting state building as a peace broker, as a service provider, as a tool for democratization. But in order to understand authority in this way, so I look at the practices, and this is why I say that it rests as a claim, and perhaps I can talk more about this later in the Q&A. But this authority is not totalizing, it's not all capable. And this is why I say that it is not as sort of a social transformation, like I think some studies from historical sociology in state formation might have portrayed, in terms of the state or the state formation process being a process of industrialization, of social stratification, of sort of social engineering. I say that it sort of rather takes place more in an interstice of absences and presence, and some of these absences are really physical. I mean, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, sometimes you have state authority being represented by sort of poorly armed, poorly trained, deployed armed forces, or even by armed groups, or by multinational corporations, or even it's just not absence. But what I criticize is that some of these absences have been encountered in terms of failure, in terms of a non-state. And I think, the case of Congo has been a paradigmatic case in terms of, the discourses on state failure. What I try to examine is more sort of the practices of how authority is constituted and how state building is deployed. And for that purpose, then I used again a Shield member and also the work of Beatrice Hebrew to look at sort of modes of governance and to theorize them as privatized and socialized forms of governance, to see that this is not some of these practices that end up in sort of this interstice of absences and presence, engaging in practices of violence and dispossession on the part of the population as well, and sort of engaging or governing through alliances with armed groups, and engaging in practices of racketeering and predation even. It's not a pathology of state building or of state building in Congo, but actually state building as such, or the practice of a state and how its authority is constituted. So for Mbembe, the control of the means of coercion to secure the appropriation of resources and the control of wealth allocations operate by ways of dispersing the use of violence amongst the population. And similarly for Beatrice Hebrew, she observes that governing through individualizing means of coercion and wealth appropriation does not entail the destruction of a state authority or the state apparatus, but rather a sort of reconfiguration and a practical application. So perhaps let me get into some practical examples that I have observed. In terms of sort of just to say a little bit more about authority, what I see is that it has three kind of elements, and that perhaps makes it a little bit different to how sort of historical sociology and state formation has conceptualized this process. And I think it is very important that a state building being claimed as a sort of peace strategy or as a conflict resolution strategy, this is for me in itself a claim to authority. It is a claim to define the problem, to decide what to do about the problem, and to execute certain policies. And it is in this process that there is an ideal being deployed, an ideal about what the state is as a service provider, as a peace broker, as an engine for development, and sort of the real practices on the ground, which are the kinds of practices that I have referred before, of working through alliances with armed groups and having forms of political authority that are far from the kind of monopoly of violence, sort of this kind of Weberian image that is sometimes embedded in the policy documents. Some of an example that I see is that, for example, the Democratic Forces of the Liberation of Rwanda, the FDLR, which is a Hutu Interahamwe militia that has been operating in the eastern part of the Congolese territory even since the Rwandan genocide. It's aiming at ousting Kagame, but is operating in sort of the eastern area, and is targeting Congolese population, and sometimes even making coalitions with some Congolese armed groups. So the strategy of the government, but also of the UN mission in Congo, is arguably just to move it around rather than to actually confront it. And similarly, there is a technique of deploying this poorly armed, poorly formed, and poorly paid army throughout the territory. And what I see is that this is actually a way of managing violence rather than stopping it or dealing with it in this kind of ideal manner that is embedded in the policy documents. Actually, this strategy does not allow the army to gain any strength, but it actually facilitates some generals' own agendas in terms of mineral exploitation and land acquisition, and also fulfill certain diplomatic compromises. Similarly to resource exploitation, I mean, the Congo is also a paradigmatic place in terms of resource exploitation, and the link between violence and resources has been paramount. Congo has one of the biggest reserves in coltan and tantalum, water and arable land, uranium, and it has provided a bit of a vicious cycle in which violence has generated economic benefits, and this has allowed then violence to continue. But again, rather than putting these resources to building infrastructure or dividends to be put towards the development of the country, controlling these resources is a source of political power. So there have been different economic actors, like armed groups, like the army itself, multinational corporations, individual entrepreneurs that have established themselves as economic operators and sometimes even displacing the population. So privatizing public resources to gain and assert political authority is again compromising this image of the public control of the economy as order and peace-generated process, and rather are generative of further violence and sort of dispossession of the population. But in a way, there is no evidence to argue that these practices will not sustain or strengthen the state in its current form. The problem is that the sort of the patchy, messy, plural ways of asserting authority have only been encountered by failure, by superposing an ideal type of what the state should be. Practices of privatized and socialized governance highlight how state consolidation does not necessarily work by monopolizing the means of violence, but actually distributing them. to assert its political authority. And similarly, asserting its authority to accumulate and distribute resources do not necessarily end up in development projects, but they are used to balance out economic actors and assert the state's political authority. Whereas state building strategies are said to have a formula to manage these practices of violence and dispossession in ways that are legitimate and that get closer to this ideal type. As I said, they remain a claim to authority, and actually these two elements of violence and dispossession constitute and consolidate political authority, but they might actually compromise state building as a peace strategy. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
My broader project looks at Bosnia and Northern Ireland, and what struck me as interesting in both cases is that despite sort of so much investment in terms of funding, in terms of sort of the international presence, or in the case of Northern Ireland, the UK and the EU, in terms of all these regional actors being involved, what seems to confound both academics and practitioners really is the continuing divisions and the continuing sectarianism, the continuing of ethnic politics, despite sometimes very well-functioning economic sort of progress, at least in the case of Northern Ireland. In terms of Bosnia, it's much different. But what really struck me is that in terms of having a community in these places, that seemed to be very divisive. So even when I came to Northern Ireland and I wanted to talk about citizenship, the first thing that I was told was, well, we don't think citizenship really resonates on the ground here. We don't think citizenship is sort of really relevant here because it implies a jurisdiction. And of course, a jurisdiction is the problem in these cases. But this is why I precisely thought citizenship needs to be looked at, because it is the issue of belonging and being part of a broader community, not simply a status. That is really important in these cases, and that we seem to have missed from sort of the top-down institutional focuses. But what I really liked looking at is this sort of, intersection between power sharing and citizenship. Because what we've done sort of in Bosnia and all these places is we have all these power sharing institutions, and we say, well, they're going to be, by representing everyone, sort of, they're going to be liked by everyone, or at least they're going to give them a voice. What we haven't looked at is how we've sort of criticized power sharing. We said, so many people have said that it freezes identities. But it doesn't just freeze identities, it continues to shape the politics that happens afterwards, right? So that there is no emergence of a community that is able to function outside of ethnic politics. And this is largely a problem that has been identified sort of in the citizenship literature, where they say, wait, the state is not culturally neutral. Northern Ireland is not culturally neutral. By being part of the UK, Northern Ireland sort of has, at least in some ways, supported, a particular community whose vision was for Northern Ireland to stay a part of the UK. Bosnia is not culturally neutral. Bosnia promotes sort of, well, Bosnia doesn't promote anything at the moment, but it has so many different kinds of identities. But it's still, by remaining a single state, it still promotes a particular kind of vision of Bosnia. So this has been identified by Will Kimlicka, and Kimlicka talks about citizenship as sort of very much shaping the culture of the state and sort of giving prevalence to particular identities. And in terms of Northern Ireland, what I found interesting was that these identities come in play through citizenship, and how citizenship is practiced in sort of everyday ways of constituting a community. And this is usually done through the language of difference and through sort of symbols, right? So language of difference is, there's a very sophisticated language of difference that is developed in both Bosnia and Northern Ireland, but in Northern Ireland maybe perhaps more so, because there are sort of questions that you can ask people, what school did you go to, which street do you live on, that due to the divisions can tell you what their ethnic background is. And this happens in everyday in everyday conversations, in everyday dialogue. And sort of symbols of difference are, there's sort of the British flag or the Irish tricolour. These tell you which territories you are in. So all of these kinds of ways are used in sort of shaping the interactions between people on the ground. I don't know if you've been to Belfast, but Belfast has a lot of peace walls. And in fact, it has more peace walls now than in 1998, which is quite problematic, right? With the signing of the Good Friday Agreement being almost 15 years ago now, you would expect this to have changed. Because on the one hand, Belfast is a very, I don't know if you've seen the Titanic corridor promotions, it's very much a very well-developed place and stuff. And then you go to where I live in North Belfast, and there's these patchworks of communities where being able to negotiate space is something that you quickly learn because of the different signings, because of the different murals, because of these different things. So all of these things are not something that we look at so from the top down. And what we've gotten somewhat good at is looking at the individual, right? We're able to say, at least in relation to Bosnia, we're able to say, these people, it doesn't matter what, their ethnic background is, they do interact with each other. We all have families that are mixed, all of this kinds of stuff. Yes, that happens at the individual level. But what is interesting is this link between sort of the communities and the state and how that relates and how that interplays with each other. And we haven't got a good lens to look at it. So I want to look at it through the citizenship lens. And what does that mean? What does it mean sort of to belong to a particular community? The trouble with that seems to be that how citizenship is seen in most of these places simply as a piece of paper, but which is interesting in relation to Northern Ireland because you can choose to be either Irish or British. And this is used by the communities, and in fact it has led to some, during my interviews, it has led to some sort of negotiating of identity. When people realize, they lose their British passport or something, they realize that they can have an Irish passport. And sometimes it's just a thing of convenience that sort of sparks these kinds of, interesting thoughts, and now more so sort of with the younger generations than before. But in Bosnia, it's still very much citizenship is usually seen as a status. And so there's very little interaction between the communities themselves and the state. And this gap that happens usually gets filled by ethnic politics because it is a way of speaking back to the state. And this is what the state representatives use to sort of get attention, to get support. And so they not only do these, power sharing arrangements sort of further reify these identities, but then sort of the ethnic politics that result also further do this. So we'd like to say that these ethnic politics are simply something that happens in these places due to sort of these local tendencies or these locals holding on to these identities. What we're not looking at is the way in which the political arrangements structure the kind of politics that occur. So I think I will end there and you can ask me more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is just a very kind of a preliminary attempt at looking at state building as a discourse, because what I'm eventually interested to do is to do an ethnographic study of state building interventions in the context of peacekeeping missions and looking at how most specifically these attempt to affect gender relations. But this is just an early attempt at kind of sketching out the theoretical framework. So if you can help me with that, don't hesitate to challenge it in the Q&A session. So what I've been doing is that I've been looking at state building as a discourse, and I've been looking specifically at how the OECD has thought and conceptualized state building through the documents it has issued since 2007, most particularly with the principles, which I'm going to come back to, because I think they have been quite central in also influencing how other organizations in the aid community have started to think about state building. So I'm also looking at documents by the World Bank and the European Commission, the UN, but mostly here I'm focusing on the OECD. And I've been interested in state building mainly because state building interventions have been really criticized by feminist observers in particular, others also, but here I'm focusing on them, because they have said that state building attempts are in fact reinforcing gender inequalities in the context of intervention. So first, women have often been systematically excluded from negotiations on political settlements. Also, the forms of violence that affect women disproportionately, such as sexual violence and human trafficking, tend to increase in post-conflict contexts, often even made more acute by interventions because of the presence of large amounts of men in uniforms, mainly. And even in the cases where women had their rights recognized in new constitutions and obtained electoral quotas and other such formal measures at increasing women's presence and voice, there has been a failure to affect the informal rules that make women less prominent actors in politics. So with the sociological turn in state building, there's been more space to talk about gender, because gender is usually thought of as a social issue and not as a political issue. But the efforts to address gender inequalities usually take the forms of interventions targeted specifically at women, and they are usually met by policymakers and practitioners as something extra they have to do, and for which they don't have the time, they don't have the resources. And what I want to argue in this paper is that the state building discourse already does gender, and therefore that it is not something extra that needs to be done. It's already being done, and to look at, to look carefully at gender and challenge gender inequalities, it is not sufficient to just kind of, do one activity with women. The whole discourse must be rethought, and this is what I'm going to examine here briefly. So just let me know for the time. Thank you. So what I'm arguing is that the terms around which the state building discourse has been developed contribute to make the reproduction of unequal gender relations in post-conflict contexts possible. However, the meanings conveyed by the state building discourse are themselves unstable and open to contestation. So it's not something that's kind of inherently patriarchal and eccentric. It can be changed, but it's been constructed as such. So I start with critical assessments of post-conflict state building. I just start from the criticisms that you probably all already know, that state building is understood as an endogenous process that is supported by international actors, but in fact, so-called indigenous state institutions must respond to certain criteria which happen to correspond to the liberal state, the ideal of the liberal Western state. So the OECD says, for instance, that the state must ensure security and justice, mobilize revenue, establish an enabling environment for basic service delivery, strong economic performance, and employment generation. So considering that it is like the liberal state model that is being exported sometimes, actually most of the time, not always in very liberal ways or very democratic ways, I have been looking at the theory of the liberal state and the feminist critique of this theory. And what the feminists have been saying about the liberal state is that contemporary theoretical and practical understandings of the state, which the international community is trying to export, privilege certain men's understanding and experiences of the world. And it does so in a number of ways. So first, the liberal state grants rights to individuals in civil society or in the public sphere, while women's labor and primary identity have historically primarily been anchored in the private sphere, where we find sexuality and family and responsibilities related to childbearing, childcare, and domestic labor. So consequently, while introducing the liberal subject as gender neutral and universal, dominant state theory and practice reproduce a certain gender order where evolving successfully in the public sphere is associated with the display of attributes coded as masculine. And it makes it easier for men, or at least those who have been successfully socialized in displaying these masculine features, in evolving in the public sphere and successfully navigate state institutions. Simultaneously, it creates conditions that encourage women to stay confined in the private sphere. And the state also constitutes humans beings as gendered subjects. So every time we interact with the state in one form or another, we need to signify what gender we belong to. Usually we check a box in a form, and this checking of a box makes certain outcomes more or less likely in our interaction with the state. So it makes it more or less possible, for instance, that you will serve in a combat position in the armed forces, or that you will be granted a parental leave, or that you will be recognized as a victim of rape or sexual harassment. So all these kind of biases have been transported in state building theory and practice, which keeps the endocentric point of view. So by endocentric point of view, I mean that men constitute most of the people who write it, as well as the default subjects of analysis and action. The abstract individuals who are produced and assumed by state building theory and practice are, however, not just any kind of men, but they bear the attribute of dominant forms of masculinity. They are competitive, and they also will be assumed to be rational, productive, and responsible, all things which have a history of being coded as masculine in Western thinking. So just to give you an example, I will focus a bit more on productivity. The productivity of the liberal subject in state-building context must take a specific form, that of regularized employment and living arrangements that are essentially sedentary. So according to the OECD, employment and school enrollment, are effective ways of dealing with the youth bulge, especially of males, that is associated with risks of instability and conflict, end of quote. This creates an opposition between, on one side, uncontrolled and violent masculinity, and on the other side, a responsible, productive masculinity that finds its rightful expression in school for the boys and remunerated work for the men. The integration of men in the formal economy is associated with different forms of social regulation and control in which the state plays an active role. These imply, at a very basic level, state knowledge of where people are physically located, which is necessary for the management of population movement. For this reason, state-building efforts favor societal arrangements that are concentric in structure, and they are incompatible with nomadic lifestyles or wanderings of large segments of population, hence the insistence on, for instance, refugee settlements program and employment program for men. So I found also an NGO report which justifies the need to maintain refugee return programs on the ground that unsettled people have or see no chance of making a living in the places they came from. And according to the same report, the high rate of unemployment, which was evaluated at 85%, increases insecurity, especially among women and girls, as sexual assault, rape, and robbery are on the rise. There is no really explanation on why unemployment in the formal market would be related to sexual violence against women and girls, but this is a type of discourse that creates an association between, on one side, participation in the formal market for men and controlled, non-violent masculinity and environment that is safe for women and girls. So state building can be read as an intervention that seeks to turn disorderly, chaotic people into predictable, legible citizens whose behavior must correspond to an ideal of liberal hegemonic masculinity. And what is interesting is that where are the women in this discourse? So women are usually assumed to just have to act like men, so adopt the same kind of features of responsible, liberal, productive masculinity. So you will have like a sentence like the following, opening of quote, men and women who interact with the state through taxation and observe a relationship between tax and services have a stake in the performance and accountability of state institutions and are willing to cede legitimacy to the government. So this is a quotation from the OECD again. So in such cases, women are expected to adopt the features of responsible, productive citizenships associated with the characters that I have described. And the assumption is that if women are to operate in the public sphere, they are expected to do so by functioning like liberal men. As a result, they are also assumed to have a similar relationship to the state and a similar interest in a functional, effective state institutions. But the assumption is problematic because there are many contexts where individual social roles and access to the state will be gender differentiated. And as a result of these shortcomings, there's been increasing calls for looking at gender issues and interventions on women's condition specifically. And in the context of these conditions, women are being framed as what they are and what they could be. And there's a new binary that is created there. So what women are in post-conflict context, they are vulnerable and excluded. So they are vulnerable mainly to local men's violence against them, and they are excluded from political processes of negotiations. And this in turn creates a situation where the international community has to intervene, both in order to make women less subject to male violence and also to make them more included in the political processes. And the logic is that the exclusion of women is considered a risk for successful state building. So women will be described as a group which exclusion is a long-term risk, since real or perceived discrimination is associated with fragility and conflict. So it creates a need to remedy this risk. And the way to remedy it is to realize the full potential of women. So then there is the other side of the binary, which is what women could be, peacemakers and state builders. So the construction of conflict-affected women as vulnerable and excluded is juxtaposed with this identity of what they could be. As women, we are told, can do much to reduce fragility and strengthen social cohesion by maintaining services, supporting social cohesion, and negotiating safe space between communities in conflict. So it's interesting because the notions of cohesion, services, and safe space are associated with a wide spectrum of human behaviors, yet at the same time they borrow from a vision of women as involved in activities of caring, comforting, nurturing that usually take place in the private sphere, and this is usually how women are conceived in the traditional Western liberal discourse of the state. So, yet women's potential is limited by issues such as early marriage, domestic violence, obstacles to educational opportunities, and discriminatory family laws, which must be intervened on, which must be changed. So this is the role of the international community. This is what they have to do in the context of state building. So the World Bank, for instance, argues that including women in security, justice, and economic empowerment program, that's a very important term because the term empowerment is exactly the transition from what women are to what women could be. It's seen as supporting longer-term institutional change at the level of the state more generally. So, women's contribution to the state and peace-building process is usually recognized either in the frame of their participation to the formal political system, so their participation in parliament or election, or in the formal economy. So, there will be an emphasis on involving them in economic initiatives as it can generate job and income and lay the basis for longer-term empowerment as well as enable them to contribute to the recovery of their community. So the assertion that women can perform effectively as service providers, even when they have been excluded from education and community decision-making in the past, that was a quote from the OECD, both naturalizes feminine gender identities associated with caring and servicing and frames their contribution as something that is commodifiable. The fact that the World Bank recognizes the need to address gender equality beyond economic empowerment only underscores the fact that economic empowerment is understood as a core, inescapable first step on the road to equality. It fails to acknowledge that women's economic empowerment often has contradictory effects, especially when it is connected to actual or perceived economic disempowerment of men. So in the state-building discourse, violence against women is only associated with tradition and non-liberal societal arrangements without considering how liberalization itself can contribute to amplify or generate patterns of violence against women. What comes to my mind when I say this is the case of the maquiladoras, where there's been an increasing number of femicides. Women are being killed in the zones around the maquiladoras, mainly by men who are considering themselves marginalized by the fact that women are cheap labor that corporations can draw on. So this is just one type of ambiguity that I'm framing here. So there is also an increasing emphasis on women's participation in security institutions such as the police force. So they will say, the World Bank will say things like, attention to gender sensitivity and women's full participation in security sector reform can contribute to success in transforming local governance institution into the institutions of a liberal democratic state. A general claim is made that the presence of women in reforming state institutions increases the population's trust and confidence in these institutions, but we never really know why this is the case. It is interesting to me because it seems to draw on this old belief that women are somehow more virtuous, less prone to violence and corruption than men are, and it's a very similar argument to what we were hearing in the West when women were first fighting for voting right. There was all this essentialist kind of line of arguing that said that women were somehow the conscience, of humanity. But the problem is that when women fail to live up to this higher standard, the whole rationale for having them included in those institutions falls down. And there are numerous cases of women being corrupt or violent, so this is also problematic. And it's also problematic because the personal agency of women is limited to what they can contribute to the formal labor market or the formal state system, for instance, as members of parliament or police officers. So the broader signification, and I'm going to conclude on this, is that there is a binary between, on one hand, excluded and vulnerable women, and on the other hand, women who are productive participants in the formal political system and the formal economy, which is attached to a broader system of dichotomies that structure the state-building discourse and which are productive of certain subject positions. One such binary is the fragile or failed states, again, against the solid and capable donor states. By labeling certain states as fragile or failed, core states also construct an image of themselves as strong or successful through a logic of difference. This dichotomy bears strong connection to the older North-South one built around a set of hierarchical binary oppositions, developed, undeveloped, first world, third world, modern, traditional, and so on. The idea of saving women motivates and gives legitimacy to a number of interventions, and the construction of women as vulnerable and excluded, but as having the potential to be productive actors, creates a space where international intervention becomes not only justifiable, but necessary. So the state-building discourse borrows on the empowerment, and the notion of empowerment to reinforce this whole rationale of legitimation of these interventions, which can be problematic because the assumption that women will be better off in a liberal state is in itself problematic, because the whole discourse of the liberal state, even in Western states, is also problematic and ambiguous in terms of what it can bring for women, as I laid out in my introduction. So I have sought to problematize the gendered implication of the state-building discourse by providing alternative accounts of actually, I didn't have time for this, sorry, but this is also what I intended to do, to show that there are also cases in the post-colonial world where without intervention from the West, gender structures were less constraining than they were in the West. So the example that comes to my mind is the Yoruba society in Nigeria, where gender, in pre-colonial times, gender bore more or less no influence on social relations. So it is problematic to assume that the gender construction as they exist in the liberal state will always be more emancipatory than what is existing in the post-colonial world. So I hope I have demonstrated that the integration of gender perspectives in state-building processes needs to go beyond add women and stir approach if we want to avoid reproducing gender inequalities in post-conflict contexts. The quest for increased gender inequality is yet in any field where the blind application or implementation of a program is incompatible with ethics or responsibility. Responsibility can only emerge when the encounter with alterity is not guided by any preconceived set of knowledge, but by adopting a state of self-doubt and undecidability on whether or not we can really bring emancipation or gender equality. Thank you, sorry for
Unintended consequences are the most enigmatic aspect of social theory because they provide or explain those difficulties in understanding the social world, because they conceive the the unintended and unpurposive aspects of social life. So, in more practical terms, policymakers, practitioners try to avoid exploring unintended consequences because they often reveal the limitation of policy planning, implementation, and anticipation. Hence, for that reason, it's important to look at the unintended consequences because they weaken the ability of peace building and state building practices, and also show the limits of mainstream practices that are currently underway. Most importantly, unintended consequences are often invoked to dilute or remove responsibility and accountability for certain outcomes of peace building and state building practices. So today in my presentation I will focus on answering two questions. First one, to explore how unintended consequences are involved in state building research. And second one, to look at the possibility to disentangle the spectrum of agency, structural conditioning, and the consequences in order to assign some sort of responsibility and moral accountability. So in doing this, first I will provide a very short conceptualization of unintended consequences across philosophical inquiries, sociological studies, and legal theory. Moving on to explore four patterns or four discursive patterns that I've identified in state building research, and then moving towards a third part, which is my own contribution on this subject, where I'm arguing to make a case for expanding the spectrum of consequences and for looking various ways of how to assign responsibility and accountability in state building practices. So, in general, intentional action is closely related to the successful satisfaction of an intent, which usually is seen as undergoing a practical reasoning process. So, as a consequence of this, if there is a failure of satisfying the intent and fulfilling that, often it is considered as an unintended action. Now, across various studies, I've encountered that there are three types of definitions on unintended consequences, or three fields, the way how they define. The first one is showing that, or privileging structure over agency, in a sense of arguing that actually there is human agency has limitations, and as such, it is not able to control the outcomes of its intent and its practices. In a sense that any sort of social practice will lead to unintended consequences, and that the society and the social world in itself is an unintended consequence of human action. So this is the first one. The second type of definitions look at the causal levels or mechanisms that encounter unintended consequences. And at this level, this type of definitions privilege agency over structure, in the sense of arguing that limits on the anticipation, limits on practical reasoning, and limits on having knowledge and ignorance, or privileging some sort of interest, are the main causes of unintended consequences. In a sense, making a case that actually there are reflective agents, and people by the nature are able to, in case they avoid this sort of factors, they will be able to reach those intended outcomes. And the third type of definitions looks at the relation between unintended consequences and responsibility and accountability. And here is quite fragile terrain, which I hope I will make a contribution. Most closely related to the notion of unintended consequences is the double effect theory, which looks at the notion that any sort of intervention will have double effects. What you intend will reach to a certain extent, but they will have also other unexpected or unwanted effects. And here it's made the case that if the intention is not fulfilled, there's a case for answerability and not accountability. But I'll work more on that as I go along. Now, building on that, I will discuss now the four patterns, how unintended consequences are involved in state building research. And it's important to look at these aspects because increasingly we're seeing that unintended consequences have become evident in any sort of state building intervention, foreign aid, humanitarian work, preventive measures, peacekeeping engagement, and so on. I won't be able to go to empirical details of my research showing case studies of how certain interventions have led to certain unintended consequences, but I'll just focus on the theoretical aspects as it is involved. So the first aspect that I'm identifying is the ambiguous invocation of the notion of unintended consequences. In the majority of the cases when the notion of unintended consequences is invoked, there's no explanation provided by scholars in peace and conflict studies, what do they mean and how they invoke it. It is semantically invoked as an empty signifier, for which you have to dig further to understand the context of their argument and the evidence they provide. But in general, literature reveals that unintended consequences are always invoked or most of the cases as negative, in a negative connotation. Looking at those legacies or looking at those effects that have fallen outside of the intent of intervention. Without pointing the finger to a particular scholar, I'll just summarize this ambiguous implication of the notion of unintended consequences across different studies, both in mainstream and also critical approach of peace building and state building. First one is that some scholars distinguish unintended consequences from failure to achieve intended consequences, as well as the deferred unintended consequences from national interest or mixed models of interveners. This is a very contested way of defining unintended consequences. Some other interchangeably use the notion of unintended consequences with wrong policies or lack of policies and so on. And then more critical approaches tend to use the notion of unintended consequences as a negative aspect, as a failure of state building to reach either its goal or what is expected by the scholar itself or by the community in general. Some other studies invoke interchangeably the notion of unintended consequences with the notion of shortcomings, contradiction, and dilemmas, which in essence they're different and mean something. So in general, all this way of portraying unintended consequences shows that there is not a sufficient epistemological commitment among scholars to really show sensitivity towards the notion and provide reality adequate analysis. Because treating all undesired and inconvenient social outcomes as unintended consequences risks reducing the problem to a set of properties that disable any adequate social analysis. And in return, that's one of my goals in this presentation, to make a case to really provide a clarification or definitional exploration of unintended consequences, which will enable a better study. So the second identified discursive pattern concerns the intertwined and unclear invocation of agency and structure as the causes of unintended consequences. There is no clear divide. Some studies argue that international structure and agency reflected by norms, practices, or institutional agents as collective agents argue that they have, because of their practices, they have consequences over local structure or agents. There are some other studies who privilege one the other, so there's a mixture of various combinations. For example, Roland Paris in his book After Wars End argues that democratization and marketization as an international structure conception threatens to destabilize internal policy, internal peace, and undermines in the first place the very reason of intervention. So showing how international structure leads to unintended consequences when it intervenes. Or the study of Edward Newman's on human security illustrates how international agency, for example, the World Bank or OECD or others, by trying to address corruption or other social practices, or privileging marketization and privatization, ignore the fact that that will have consequences over local agency and all local agents. So showing how international agency has consequences over local agency. Now, critical approaches to peace building and state building often consider the strategy of international state building as primary cause of unintended consequences. And as such, they make a case that ignoring local agency and local knowledge and practice basically leads to failure and delayed reconciliation and sustainable peace. For example, Chandler invokes the notion of agency structure interchangeably, in a sense, arguing that the international state building has consequences for both local structure and both local agency. In terms of local structure, is by building some sort of institutional networks of policy making that are accountable to external agents or structures, bridge or break the relation between people and community. And equally, by empowering a liberal civil society, they are not making a contribution to building sustainable citizenship and connection with local population. And in that way, making a case how unintended consequences occur both at the local structure, at local agency and local structure. So these three variations of intertwined agency structure implications show the complexity of the levels of analysis and show how complex it is to really disentangle the way how unintended consequences are operated in this research. What I'm arguing is that we have to make a case to go beyond individual privileging of agency or a structure, but look more towards a methodological realism that looks at the structure and agency as separate but still mutually constituted in the practices of everyday life or in interactions. Okay, so the third discursive pattern concerning research concerns the research programs and paradigmatic intentions of scholars. Supporters of liberal peace building invoke the notion of unintended consequences mainly to signify those shortcomings of state building, neutralize the political agency, and in a way soften the responsibility. Whereas the other side, critical scholars tend to use unintended consequences as justification for criticizing current practices, legitimizing it, or making a case for alternative ways of dealing in post-conflict societies. Because of short time, I won't be able to illustrate some cases of this paradigmatic divide, but I believe you might have during the Q&A session, we'll be able to discuss that. The final discursive feature on unintended consequences examines the spectrum of solutions that scholars provide to how to deal with and handle unintended consequences. And in this case, compared to critical scholars, those that are propagating or supporting mainstream approaches are more advanced in the sense of providing a solution how to deal with unintended consequences. Supporters of liberal peace building often identify the lack of planning, coordination, sufficient resources, and multilateral commitment as the main, and also insufficient local knowledge as the main factors that lead to unintended consequences. Hence, they argue that improving these weaknesses enables state builders or peace builders to either handle, prevent, or reduce unintended consequences. On the other hand, critical scholars rarely provide any alternative how to deal with unintended consequences. But in general, recently we've seen kind of a shift of critique with alternatives, which tends to make a case for an emancipatory post-liberal peace that privileges local agents, shows them as capable of handling the situation, and in a sense, making the case that if we have better local knowledge, if we have better access to local needs and local culture, we'll be able to anticipate and deal more properly with unintended consequences. So, from these four discursive patterns, we can see that there is a need for a clarification, a conceptual clarification of unintended consequences. There's a need to move beyond paradigmatic research agenda, because we're missing in between practices and problems. We're missing this essential dimension of social analysis that should be neutral and reality adequate analysis. Not necessarily privileging one type of knowledge, but trying to provide a balanced and plural understanding of situation. And in doing this, I'm proposing expanding the spectrum of consequences by a four-step process. First step is to look at the intended goals or intentions of peace building and state building. How we do that? Well, easily we look at the UN Security Council resolutions. We look at the national action plans, resolutions, other operative documents, so that a tangible framework of starting the analysis of unintended consequences. Moving from that, and usually local intentions of peace building are usually local stability, reconstruction, public security, human rights, and the legal system, institution building, and so on. In the international side of intentions, usually state building practices tend to maintain peace and security at the international level, to legitimize the intervention, and so on and so on. So the first part is to look at the intended goals. Second one is to explore the context as an enabler, barrier, and meaning changing in the process of how an intended goal leads to an unintended goal. Context is essential to understand how certain intended goals lead to unintended consequences. And this is not very much made the case in current practices of state building and research. Moving on to the spectrum of consequences, I argue that we should look at three types of consequences: unintended consequences, unanticipated consequences, and unprevented consequences. And the reason for this divide is that there are legitimate unintended consequences that occur, that it's difficult to point the finger to a particular agent. And they occur in a long run, in a long period of time. It's difficult to measure and difficult to analyze. Then the second one, unanticipated consequences, is essential because it makes a case for peace builders and state builders to be more cautious, more sensitive, more prepared towards local knowledge, local practices, and culture, and in this way engage more accurately and towards chances, advanced chances for sustainable peace. And the third one, unprevented consequences, which I haven't mentioned somewhere else. I argue that by bringing on unprevented consequences, we're making a strong case, because we have to allocate responsibility for those for inaction of state builders and peace builders, and also delayed or ignorance of certain practices. So by putting forward the notion of unprevented consequences, we'll be able to show that actually current practices of state building have limitations, and as such, there is a case to hold them accountable. So the fourth part of the fourth step in the process of looking at consequences is allocation of responsibility. It's pointless to identify consequences and assign moral agency without allocating some sort of responsibility. So what I'm arguing is that we need to have in mind three types of responsibility, which is attributability, transferability, and accountability. Attributability is, in a sense, light attribution of certain blaming, exempting, naming, or critiquing a certain outcome, and usually it should be part of the unintended consequences, unanticipated consequences, and unprevented consequences. It's a consequentialist by nature because it aims to make state builders and peace builders more sensitive and be aware that in case they ignore something in the process, they will be attributed to certain attribute. Second one, transferability is important, and transferability means the agent that has caused the consequence, or is suspected that has caused the consequence to be answered answerable to a structure, to an agency, to an institution. And for this purpose, there's some new practices, for example, Kosovo with human rights advisory panel or ULEX review panel, where we don't have accountability, but we have only answerability, where a case is dealt and an answer is provided, but no other further remedy is taken. And the third type of responsibility, which is well known, is political and legal accountability, which means that and it should be evident for unanticipated and unprevented consequences. What I'm arguing is that if state builders do not anticipate the consequences, or we have unanticipated consequences and unprevented consequences as a result of their practices, there's a case to explore political and legal accountability. And this is by either sanctioning or rewarding in the process. So, in conclusion, what unintended consequences show us is the limitations of human agency, the limitation of any sort of state building intervention, whether it's in the side of mainstream peace builders or those propagated by critical approaches. And it shows that actually it's the only field, or one of the rare fields, where it bridges between different paradigms and different, because it goes beyond that, and it shows an invisible and a complex side of social structure, which if we ignore, we might miss the point of what causes what and how, and understanding how social processes work. So, in very end, it's important to include understanding of unintended consequences in peace building practices, in policy practices, but also at academic level, because there's a huge gap both among practitioners and also scholars to really deal with unintended consequences, basically because it's a very complex topic, but that doesn't mean that we should try. I'll leave it there and we'll talk more.
Thank you. Okay, we now open the floor for half an hour for Q&A sessions. So if there's any question, if you can just raise your hand.
Thank you all. My first question is to, I think, Marta, is that right? I really like your work, but there's one thing that I'm wondering about, which is how you're getting a theoretical framework together to manage the concepts of authority within a very complex conflict like the conflict in the DRC, because there seem to be multiple sources of authority within the northeast of the DRC from rebel groups, the UN, the government, and the wildcard of the NRA as well. So these all have different centrifugal agendas in trying to consolidate authority and break it apart. So do you have any kind of theoretical framework that can bind these actors together and also accommodate the regional and international dimensions to the Congolese conflicts? Big one. And my second one is to Audrey. I really like that sort of focus on gender dimensions, but it's one thing which I was wondering if you're taking into account, which is, and I understand your project's at an early stage right now. So you're talking about how masculinity and masculine qualities are reproduced and reinforced through the state building processes, including the actors. But I'm wondering about, and this is not unusual for state building research, but it tends not to focus on the preceding conflict that came prior to the state building experience. So I'm wondering if you will be able to kind of integrate the legacies of the Civil War that preceded the state building experience and look at why it is that these actors that embody these masculine qualities seem to continually rise to the top when it comes to state building experiences. And so you could, for instance, look at how the gender dimensions to the formation, practices, goals, justifications, and compositions of insurgents. And this could also have relevance for your choice of case studies if you pursue an ethnographic. Thank you.
Just take a few questions and then we'll... Anything else? Any more questions? Just raise your hand.
Okay. Thanks for the presentations. Two quick but quite broad questions to both Audrey and Audrey was really a comment more than a question. I thought this dichotomy between what you call the kind of binary category, formal and informal, which you looked at in the context of gender is interesting, with women on the one hand in the informal sphere as portrayed as vulnerable victims versus productive contributors to a state of building process. And of course, in a way which you didn't mention, but you could do the same for men as well. And to say, on the one hand, it's you're violent, corrupt, spoilers versus productive participants in either a formal political process or the formal economy. So I think you can actually extend that binary distinction into both in different gender dimensions. But to what extent does it really, yes, it is interesting to focus it from a gender perspective, but it's really a much broader issue of how that state building that cannot deal with informal institutions, or out of a principle sees them as, the whole discourse tends to see them as disruptive, rather than really examining the much more complicated relationships that exist in all of these cases between informal actors and structures on the one hand and the formal world of political institutions and the formal economy. With regards to Gazim, how can you look at unintended consequences when we don't really know anything about the intentions? I mean, you suggest to look at intentions through mandates. Well, you look at the Kosovo mandate for a start. Where do you find any intention there? Meaningful autonomy? What's that intention? You look at other mandates and they become a shopping list of things that don't add up to a whole. And partly it's because they seem to reflect the intentions of so many different actors which have very different objectives and very different intentions. So how do you actually distinguish between intended and unintended consequences in the context of World Bank efforts to reduce the size of the states? What becomes an intended and unintended consequence when you start to cut education expenditure, social welfare expenditure? What if this is unintended? Surely, well, you can assume that it wasn't the intention of them to push 1 million people into poverty, but it's an inevitable consequence of this particular action of the intended consequence to reduce expenditure on welfare. So I'm not sure that the distinction between the two is as clear as you make it. And that has, I think, consequences both for, in a way, the epistemic problem of identifying what is unintended consequence and what are the kind of the causes of those, but also for the normative problem of assigning accountability, responsibility, and developing accountability.
And we'll just take one last question, and if you can keep your questions for the second round, we'll get to that as well.
Thank you very much, your panel. It's very interesting. I have a question to our last panelist, Gazim. Very interesting topic. I was wondering, you said ignoring local knowledge or local input is one of the failures, or something that leads to these unintended consequences. Very interesting. Couldn't agree more on the lack of local knowledge. But how would you suggest we improve that? How would you suggest what sort of framework, methodology, or reforms would you suggest for that? And then I have a question for Branka. Very interesting how you talk about citizenship and identity. I was wondering, I'm not sure if I missed it in the presentation, but I was wondering if you look at official citizenship, do you also look at alternative identities, especially in the context of states such as Bosnia and Northern? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for these questions. Can I ask, please, the panelists to keep your answers as concise as you can, so we can give everyone a chance to ask more questions. Branka, do you want to start?
Sure. Of course I look at official citizenship, but only to point out that it was addressed in a very sort of systematic way to say that, okay, Northern Ireland can either be Irish or British. In Bosnia, there were some provisions that were changed. Of course, now there's been some developments with Serbia giving its sort of kin in the Republika Srpska and Kosovo and other places, giving the opportunity to apply for Serbian citizenship, even if you don't live in Serbia, right? So all of these sort of these kin states do, and of course we have that with Croatia and Bosnia as well, right? So you have these kin states impacting what is happening in Bosnia. In Northern Ireland, it's because of this sort of ability to choose between these identities. It's the real problem is that there isn't sort of a common identity, and they really tried hard at a very sort of at the civil society level to create common identities. sort of to work with each other and have linkages with each other. The problem is really at the state level. There is a cohesion, sharing, and integration document that went out in 2010, and that was sent back for review and sort of got reviews from the civil society people and all of these academics and others. And I think it received really, really poor reviews because there's been nothing since. And I tried getting, from these offices to talk to me, and they completely ignored me. So, but there was a document in 2007 trying to sort of, deal with this issue of lack of common identity in Northern Ireland. But in terms of alternative identities, I mean, in Bosnia we have a big problem due to the political arrangements. We don't recognize, because of the Serbs, the Croats, and the Bosniaks are the constituent peoples, we don't recognize others. So they can't be heads of state. I'm sure you all know this. So they can't be heads of state and all this kind of stuff. So I guess, well, I kept it very brief because we got a note saying you have to be very brief. But what I should have maybe talked about more is the ways in which these identities are negotiated on the ground, which is not translated to the state level because of that sort of filling of that vacuum between the state and the society by sort of ethnic entrepreneurs and others. And so then all you hear is that. But I guess the real problem was that there, in the literature now, there's a lot of romanticization of the local and sort of focus on the local, sort of the answer to a lot of things. But we don't, coming from the local, I think I see sort of the fragmentation that exists there. And sort of even within the communities, we try to portray them as, the Serbs in Kosovo say this, and I'm like, who are the Serbs in Kosovo, right? So it's so fragmented, and that in terms of that fragmentation, I think that is nicely captured in these community politics. But then we come to the problem of power. The local, we always like to ignore that element of power there. And I think through that sort of interaction between individuals and the state, the element of power comes out, because at the end of the day, the state institutions have a lot more power than the locals. So I guess that's a very long way to answer your question and address some of the maybe things I should have addressed at the outset. Thank you.
Yeah, well, authority, thanks for the question. I'm still grappling with it, and would like any feedback. But so far, I'm building upon Achille Mbembe's framework, who builds also his own framework on Foucault. So, in a way, authority, or even power, if you want, something not that you have, but something that is sort of constituted more through practice. And he identifies, this is what makes sense to me when in terms of what I've seen in the field. It's sort of these practices that very much go towards working through different alliances, and are very, very tied to modes of appropriation, sort of even prestige, power type of relationships, and then all these together with violence. And there is a very neat connection with all these that represents who is who is representing authority at any certain point in time. And it is certainly difficult. This is why I'm saying that perhaps we should start to see state building through the absences of it, because as you have mentioned, when you go to certain areas of Congo, you're not going to see state authorities. You're going to see the LRA, you're going to see the FDLR, you're going to see the Mai Mai militias, you're going to see multinational corporations. I'm arguing that they are forms of authority operating on the ground, and they have in common this kind of features that they also come with the claim of legitimacy, which is very important, and I'd like to go more into it, but perhaps we can talk about this. Is something that Achille Mbembe identifies, that despite these practices of appropriation, dispossession, and violence, they do come with a claim of legitimacy, and he then brings Hegel and the violence of right, and then it gets all very intellectual and stuff. But this is how I'm framing it. So thank you.
Oh yeah, Dominic. you're correct when you said that it's difficult to understand or study intentions. And intentions, even within ourselves, transform, change, and so are difficult to measure. What I argue in my paper is that we should find a tangible point, and we should construct the human agency in that way, so that we look at the goal-oriented intentions and look at those intentions manifested or documented in something that we can go back and refer it as a tangible evidence. So that's my point on the intentions. We can't read people's mind, but intentions means that's the first step before taking an action. And action is the manifestation of intent. And the action is the consequence in the sense of producing a strategy or producing a solution, putting that in the paper, and then implementing it. So by looking at the action and putting action in the center, and then tracing the agent of that action, and then there you can find, for example, I'm doing similar analysis in Kosovo, East Timor, and Bosnia, and I'm managing to find actually, or disentangle intentions by looking at various levels of how actions are manifested or articulated, and then how they're codified or evident. In terms of distinguishing between inevitable and unintended consequences, or unavoidable, I think it's important to, and that's the whole point of my paper, to construct a type of agency that is reflective and responsible. And we should think that in that direction, that agent should, there's no agency without responsibility, in the sense of we can't claim to have agential capacity if we are not able to take responsibility for that. And for that reason, I thought attributability as a light form of accountability, you can say, or responsibility, is the correct measure to make aware the agent beforehand, before committing an action, that there is a responsibility, and that's the whole point of a new type of social contract of obligations and rights. Seeing any sort of social intervention cautiously and sensitively, that it might have implications beyond what you intend to do. And in case of World Bank and all that, we have to assume that if someone is considered agent, they have choices, they have capacity to change things, they have some sort of not free will, but autonomous space of action within the constraints that structure provides. So, but it's very fragile terrain, and it needs further work. Now, responding to the other question on local knowledge. First of all, local knowledge is hegemonic in itself. It's not a singular. It's situational. It's transformable. It's violent. There's different levels of local knowledge. What we encounter as local knowledge is, in essence, competition between different interest perspectives of local agents. So the best way, I think, to get closer to local knowledge is develop a more empathic or a closer relation with local community. The closer you are to local people, the longer you live with them, you learn their language, learn their culture, you'll be able to encounter that the process, how local knowledge is made and how hegemonically is invoked within itself, or what James Scott calls the hidden transcript of resistance, or this type of informal interactions. And the more farther you are, far away you are from local community, then you will miss a lot of aspects of local knowledge, and you will take for granted only the product of what is served to you as local knowledge, either by local leaders, civil society, surveys, studies, and you will miss the point. You'll miss the dynamical and processual complexity that encounters at everyday level of local communities. So, but even if you manage to go to the deepest level of community, you'll be disappointed to see that there is no such a thing as consensus, or there is no such a thing as a consensus in cultural practices and so on. So it's very kind of content aspect of life.
Okay. Yeah. So this is an absolutely fascinating question that is high interest to me, that you mentioned the legacies of violent masculinities after conflict. To address it briefly, I would just say that this is exactly what I mean, what I think it's problematic to equate gender with women, which is still the overwhelming tendency in the aid community and the scholarly community to a large extent. And particularly in DDR processes, there is no recognition of the social dimension of how violent masculinities are constructed, and how, for instance, the expression of masculinity gets attached to the manipulation of weapons, you know, and how difficult it is to have an effective disarmament process without taking this into account. And also, indigenous healing processes are interesting in this respect. There is a number of cases of, for instance, church getting involved in promoting alternative masculinities in post-conflict context. So this is also an interesting alternative to the corrective masculinity associated with the market, for instance, like productive employment in the market or in the state. Then for the other question of the formal versus informal binary as a broader issue than a gender issue, I certainly agree. Maybe something that I can add to that that I didn't mention, because it's not really something that I have the data to support it, it's more an intuition that I have, is that the transition to the informal, so the state of like chaos or disorganization or violence that the international community is striving to transform to a state of orderly, productive, normalized state, is a process that can only be done if the international community attributes to itself the legitimacy to intervene in a certain way. And I think that this process of attributing a certain legitimacy is gendered, because the characterization of post-conflict populations as fragile, dependent, irrational, it's a feminization of these populations, because all these characteristics have been associated with femininity. And it means that the international community can position itself as masculine. It draws on resources which makes it look as responsible, authoritative, and rational, which are coded masculine in Western thought. And this in turn allows them to draw on other characteristics associated with masculine behavior, hence the legitimate use of responsible coercive measures. So when I'm saying this, of course I'm drawing on more traditional gender roles in the West, where you used to have families where the man or the husband was expected to have their wife behave and the children behave. So you would have sentences such as, oh, wait till your father gets home, because he would be assumed to have the legitimate authority to correct the children. Or you would still hear things, even today, like, oh, we know who wear the trousers in this couple, and if it's the woman, it's assumed to be something that's wrong. So there is this idea of like this legitimate authority or this responsible authority that the man has. And if the international community can attribute that to themselves, then they can look legitimate in being coercive in the way they are trying to build a state in post-conflict populations. So I think that gender still can help us to understand this dynamic of attribution of legitimacy.
Okay, thank you. We just have just about 5 minutes, so if you can quickly some questions. So we have the gentleman at the back. Yes.
Sure, that's okay. Thank you very much. Just two very brief comments. One for Marta, I think. I just wonder if the comparison of state and non-state authority is it's helpful to see it within the context of globalization and fragmentation and the overall context of international relations kind of context. And because I'm sure it was very inadvertent and it's very peripheral comment that you used the words peace building and state building as if they were one word. It seems to me on a few occasions, and I think definitions of peace building are contested and not clear at all. But even if you call it post-conflict peace building, which is also contestable, and you define it in that way, then I think that making that distinction may well be helpful to the purpose of the conference if we're talking about the social aspects of state building, because I think that distinction is actually very helpful. Thank you.
We have the lady with white scarf.
I'm looking at from what you were discussing, talking about parameters of post-conflict feminists. They have these two issues in their discourse, talking about the rejection of the Western feminists universalizing feminist experience and marginalization of post-conflict feminism. So I'm trying to know what is the position of state building on this issue.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, the discourse of the post-colonial feminists, talking about the marginalized, the Western feminists.
Okay, the position of post-colonial feminists. Okay.
Yeah.
On this issue.
Yes.
Okay.
Talking about the Western feminists universalize the experience of feminism and the marginalization of their literature and their political recognized. What is the position of state building in this issue?
And we have one last question.
Thank you very much. Just a comment and a question to Gizim. You said that we can't claim to have agency without responsibility. Don't you think that in that regard one views agency too narrow? For instance, Mitchell gives a wonderful account with a group of experts how nature is actually an agent and how nature influences human agency quite a lot, and how this dichotomy between humanity as being an agent with intent and intentions and all that, and a nature which where humanity just works upon, how this dichotomy actually doesn't make sense. And just another question, you said, and I very much agree with that, that of course the local knowledge needs to be much more included in discourses on state building and in state building on the ground itself. However, I think it's important to look at the function of this discourse. I mean, I guess everybody would want to include local knowledge, and everybody says that. However, I think this depoliticized and technocratic discourse is at the center of the problem. Because everybody wants to include local. However, if you phrase something in terms of being technocratic and depoliticized, then it doesn't really matter anymore. Then you don't need to persuade anything anymore. It's just a technocratic thing, and which in the end functions again in order to keep the expert as the one who knows what it is about, and the expert that knows what is wrong in the country and what needs to be implemented. And it's not a political debate anymore.
Thank you. Thank you.
Responding to the first question on division between discoursive and state building, I understand and I agree with you that I dislike both of the terms, but just for the sake of this paper and for the sake of capturing the broader debates, I had to refer to both of them. And I'm aware of the differences, I'm aware of overlaps, but I'm working on my own thesis to change this conception and then merge it with this research later on. So, but I agree with your point. The second one, concerning the agency and responsibility, I was referring to human agency and not as nature, as an agent in itself. And my conception of agency, I mean, learning process, evolving my notion of what I understand of agency. I'm moving towards understanding different types of agency and not treating agency as a singular. For example, Margaret Archer brilliantly shows that there are three types of agency, or whatever if we can call three types of units: people, agents, and actors. And then the more you have capacities, the more you have authority, you go higher, becoming an actor. And that's an interesting conception of dividing agency. And this one related to the functions of local knowledge. I agree that local knowledge is very political. And unless we separate different types of local agents, we will be unable to understand different types of different functions of local knowledge. Because, for example, we can identify in another work I'm doing, I've identified 8 types of local actors or agents. And from the very basic one who are existential, who do nothing, just live in that place and just populate that region. They have different type of knowledge and they have different function of that knowledge. Moving towards those who take a greater role or capture a greater role in society, who reproduce or involve different type of knowledge. And usually international peace builders often meet those local agents who are in between those that are at the very bottom of the scale to those that are more advanced. So, and then the local knowledge that's served to internationals is usually that one that is kind of manufactured, reproduced, filtered, because any international interviewer or scholar who does field research will never be able to encounter hidden transcript of truth unless he lives there maybe for 10, 20 years and becomes one of them and is accepted to community. So unless we reach that goal of anthropological affiliation with the local community, we will not be able to understand the function, dilemmas, conflicts that occur at the everyday level.
Yes, thank you for your question. It's a very good one. What do post-colonial feminists have to say? And the thing is, I haven't found any who have discussed the issue of state building specifically, which is why I decided to write this paper. But what post-colonial feminists had to say about the state more generally, which is kind of where I drew my inspiration, is that it's always kind of a dilemma for women and feminists in the post-colonial world on how they deal with the state, because on one side the state can provide a certain amount of protection from traditionally oppressive masculinities, and provide a certain amount of resources like healthcare or like childcare that they can draw on. But at the same time, the states in post-colonial contexts have also been oppressive to women in many contexts, like through fertilization program, just one example that comes to my mind. So, but then I think that this dilemma is pretty similar to the dilemma that women face in the West as well. So this analysis is a bit unsatisfying for me, because I don't think it adds much to what feminists have already said about this dilemma that women are encountering in the West as well. But so this is why I'm interested in this topic, because I think it hasn't been fully explored yet.
Okay, I'm going to have to be cruel and close this session so that we can leave space for the next panel. So thank you very much to all of our panelists. I'm sure that if you have any other questions, I'll be happy to respond during the break. Thank you.